In the dawn of ancient Mesopotamia, where the rivers of the Tigris and Euphrates carved silver paths across the earth, life moved to the rhythm of water, sun, and soil. It was a land of fertility and longing, a cradle where humanity first began to name its gods, to trace its desires upon clay tablets, and to surrender its heart to mysteries greater than itself. Here, myths were not distant tales whispered in temples alone. They were the very breath of the people, woven into harvests, into births, into the aching knowledge that all beauty must fade. The land was lush, yet fragile. Its fields ripened beneath a golden sun, their stalks heavy with grain that promised survival, yet always under the threat of flood or drought. Every season carried within it both blessing and peril. And so the people looked to the heavens, imagining divine hands in every shift of the wind, divine breath in every unfolding of spring. Out of these visions was born a pantheon, both fierce and tender. Gods who embodied not only the order of the world, but also the chaos of desire. Among them was Ishtar, the radiant goddess of love and war, of passion and storm. She was the very pulse of life, both intoxicating and dangerous. To whisper her name was to taste honey laced with fire. She could heal with the gentlest caress or destroy with a glance of disdain. The hymns carved in her honor painted her as luminous, resplendent, yet unpredictable, the embodiment of longing that nourishes and wounds in equal measure. Her presence was everywhere, in the blush of young lovers, in the cry of battle, in the ripening of fields, and in the wild ache of the human heart. And in this fertile, trembling world of gods and mortals lived Tammuz, the shepherd, a mortal man, yet unlike any other. He was beauty clothed in simplicity, a youth whose hands tended flocks, whose eyes reflected both innocence and quiet strength. He belonged to the earth, to the fields, to the soft murmur of sheep grazing at twilight. Yet something in him called to the divine, as if his very flesh carried the fragrance of eternal spring. He was not a warrior, not a king, but in his fragility he carried a rare power, the power to awaken desire even in the heart of a goddess. It was in this meeting of worlds, divine and human, immortal and fleeting, that the story of Ishtar and Tammuz found its breath. A love that defied its boundaries, intoxicating and perilous, tender and destructive. Their tale was not a gentle harmony, but a collision of forces, where passion became both sanctuary and snare. The myth begins, as all myths do, with a land yearning for explanation, with people watching the seasons turn and asking why life and death must be entwined. They saw spring arrive in laughter and color, summer swell with heat and abundance, and autumn bring its slow, withering sigh. Then came winter, stark and unrelenting, when the fields fell silent and the earth itself seemed to grieve. It was in these cycles that the people of Mesopotamia found the echo of Ishtar's love and her sorrow, of her embrace and her loss. In the death of the harvest, they felt the absence of Tammuz. In the greening of spring, they felt his return. But behind the rhythm of the earth lay the deeper, more dangerous truth, a love that dared to press against the boundaries of life and death. For when Ishtar's eyes first fell upon Tammuz, it was not merely affection that stirred within her. It was hunger, desire, the primal ache to possess and to preserve what was destined to fade. She was divine, eternal, yet he was fleeting. The contrast was a wound and a lure. To hold him was to taste eternity's greatest risk, the risk of loss. Imagine the first encounter, the goddess descending in radiance, her beauty sharp enough to blind, her fragrance thick with promise. And there, among the fields, the shepherd, startled, humbled, yet unable to turn away. What words were spoken between them? None that history preserved, for such moments are carved not in clay, but in silence, in the quickened breath, in the touch that lingers too long. What survives is the echo, that the goddess of love, fierce and unyielding, bent toward a mortal, and in that bending she bound the fate of the seasons. This is the myth we enter, a tale where the boundaries blur, where desire is as fertile as the rivers, yet as devastating as their floods. A tale where the intimacy of two bodies becomes the measure of time itself, where longing and grief entwine as naturally as roots beneath the soil. To speak of Ishtar and Tammuz is to speak of the sweetness of passion and the bitterness of impermanence. It is to trace with trembling hands the fragile beauty of the human body, the fleeting glow of youth, and the desperation of a goddess who would not let go. It is to witness love not as sanctuary, but as struggle, fierce, consuming, unrelenting. The story begins in the dreamlike haze of Mesopotamia, with the world still young, with gods still walking among men. It begins with a goddess radiant in her strength, whose heart, though divine, longed for touch. And it begins with a mortal, unaware of the weight his beauty carried, unaware that his fate would be bound not only to a goddess, but to the turning of the earth itself. In this union, we glimpse the eternal truth of myth, that love is never simple, never safe. It is desire pressed against fragility, eternity bending toward mortality, passion daring to challenge even the cycles of life and death. Ishtar and Tammuz. Their names are inseparable, carved together in the memory of humanity, their story retold across centuries, not as a gentle song, but as a hymn of fire and sorrow. For theirs is a love that does not merely live, it dies and returns, dies and returns, as endlessly as the seasons. And within that rhythm lies the ache we all know, to hold what slips through our fingers, to yearn for what we cannot keep, to love even when love promises loss. The myth begins not in triumph, but in tension, not in certainty, but in trembling. a goddess and a mortal, a love destined to shape the cycles of the world, a passion so consuming it dares to stand against death, even as death waits, patient and inevitable, at the edge of every embrace. And so, with the rivers shimmering in the sun, with fields heavy with promise and shadows already whispering of decline, we step into their story, a story of beauty and fragility, of ecstasy and grief, of a goddess who could not resist and a mortal who could not endure. A story that reminds us even now that love is the most dangerous gift the gods ever gave to humankind. For in Mesopotamia, where myths were born as prayers and prayers became myths, Ishtar and Tammuz rise like twin flames, burning in defiance of the dark. Their passion lights the dawn of spring, their loss stains the silence of winter, and in their tale we see ourselves reflected, fragile, desiring, endlessly reaching for what we know we cannot keep. This is where it begins, among rivers and fields, among gods and mortals, in the place where love first dared to challenge the cycle of life and death. This is the introduction to their myth, the first breath of a story both sensual and tragic, a story that even the passing centuries could not silence. And as the curtain rises upon their love, we are invited to linger at the edge of its fire, to taste its sweetness, to feel its sting, to surrender ourselves to the myth of Ishtar and Tammuz. To understand the myth of Ishtar and Tammuz, we must first let our gaze linger upon them separately, before watching how desire binds them together. For every myth is not merely about events, but about the beings who ignite them, about the way their essence bends the fabric of destiny. Ishtar and Tammuz are not just lovers caught in a tragic rhythm. They are mirrors of the divine and the mortal, of eternity and fragility, of hunger and surrender. Ishtar was the daughter of the heavens, the goddess whose presence shimmered like the heat of the midday sun. She was radiant in ways no mortal words could ever fully contain. Yet poets tried, sculptors tried, and priests chanted her hymns until their voices broke. To some, she was the goddess of love, the gentle stir of passion, the soft unfolding of desire in spring. To others, she was the goddess of war, fierce and unstoppable, crimson in her fury. But to all, she was magnetic, her beauty not simply a thing to behold, but a force that pulled, demanded, consumed. Her eyes were said to hold the blaze of morning stars, both tender and merciless. Her lips promised sweetness, yet hinted at peril, as if every kiss carried both healing and poison. She wore her divinity not as a crown, but as a second skin. The air itself trembled around her. Those who drew close felt both blessed and endangered, as if standing at the edge of a precipice, knowing one more step would send them falling, and yet longing to fall. Ishtar's beauty was not passive. It did not simply invite, it commanded. She was not content to be adored. She wanted to be pursued, worshipped, touched, and feared. She embodied longing itself, not the delicate yearning of a quiet heart, but the fierce, wild hunger that sets blood aflame. When she moved, the world shifted. When she whispered, kingdoms trembled. When she wept, the earth itself seemed to grieve. And yet, beneath this divine radiance lay something more fragile, more human, a loneliness born of eternity. For who could touch a goddess without trembling? Who could stand at her side without bowing beneath the weight of her power? She longed not merely to be worshipped, but to be held, to be seen not as goddess, but as woman. It was this ache, hidden beneath layers of divinity, that left her vulnerable to the shepherd's gaze.
Tammuz, by contrast, was mortal. He bore no crown, wielded no sword, commanded no city. He was a shepherd, a simple man, whose hands were roughened by labor, whose body carried the sun's warmth and the earth's scent. Yet within that simplicity lay his power. He was beautiful, not with the carved perfection of statues, but with the fragile glow of youth. His skin bore the flush of life, his lips the sweetness of spring, his eyes the quiet depth of rivers at dusk. He was the kind of beauty that did not proclaim itself, yet lingered in memory long after one had looked away. There was innocence in him, yes, but also a quiet strength. He knew the rhythms of the land, the birth of lambs, the grazing of flocks, the slow patience of seasons. His life was one of cycles, of beginnings and endings, of watching what he loved grow, flourish, and fade. Perhaps it was this knowledge, etched into his very being, that drew Ishtar to him. For he embodied what she could never truly touch: mortality, fragility, the fleeting sweetness of a life that ends. Imagine that first gaze. Ishtar descending in radiance, accustomed to mortals bowing, trembling, unable to meet her eyes. And yet, here stood Tammuz, not fearless, but unbroken. His gaze did not challenge hers, but neither did it collapse beneath it. He saw her not as goddess to be feared, but as woman to be desired. And in that recognition, she felt both disarmed and enthralled. When she touched him, the air grew heavy, as if the world itself leaned closer to witness. His mortal flesh, warm and fragile beneath her hand, sent shivers through her immortal frame. She was used to the caresses of kings, the devotion of priests, the songs of cities, but never had she touched something that could slip away, something that might vanish with the passing of seasons. In that fragility, she found ecstasy and terror intertwined.
And for Tammuz, what was it to be desired by a goddess? To feel her gaze upon him was to feel the sun itself choose him, to feel eternity bend low enough to taste. Yet he knew, even in the flush of her embrace, that he was mortal, that every kiss he gave her was a kiss stolen from time. He loved her with the desperation of one who knows each moment is borrowed, who knows each embrace might be the last. Theirs was not a gentle love, but a consuming one. When they drew near, the world itself seemed to hold its breath. The rivers shimmered more brightly, the fields ripened more swiftly, the air thickened with the scent of blossoms. And yet, beneath this intoxication lay the shadow of imbalance. For how could the eternal and the fleeting remain bound without consequence? How could desire, pressed so fiercely against mortality, do anything but break? The divine and the human were never meant to be equals. Ishtar's love was fierce, but it was also possessive. She wanted Tammuz not only in the now, but forever. She wanted to bind his fleeting youth into eternity, to make of him something he was never meant to be. And Tammuz, though he loved her with all the fervor of his mortal heart, felt the weight of her desire pressing against his fragile body, threatening to consume what little time he had. It is this tension, the pull between goddess and mortal, that shapes their story, a tension as old as myth itself, where love becomes both salvation and destruction, where touch both heals and wounds. Ishtar, radiant and dangerous, reaching for what she cannot hold. Tammuz, fragile yet irresistible, surrendering even as he trembles. Together they embody the essence of myth, love that is larger than life and yet bound by death. Their attraction was not an accident. It was a collision written into the very fabric of the world, as inevitable as the changing of seasons. And just as spring blooms only to wither into autumn, so too did their passion carry within it the seed of its own undoing. But in this moment, in their first gazes, their first touches, none of that mattered. What mattered was the fire in her eyes, the softness of his lips, the way eternity bent low to cradle fragility in its arms.
This is how we must see them before the conflict unfolds. Ishtar, the goddess of desire, radiant and magnetic, aching with loneliness beneath her divinity. Tammuz, the shepherd, tender and fragile, yet irresistible in his simplicity, carrying in his very mortality the power to captivate a goddess. Their love is not yet tragedy, not yet grief. It is still blossoming, still radiant, still trembling with the sweetness of beginnings. And yet, even here, we feel the shadow at its edges, for in their gaze lies both promise and peril, both ecstasy and loss. To love is to risk, and in their love the risk is magnified 1,000-fold. For when divinity bends toward mortality, when eternity longs for what must fade, the outcome can never be simple. And so we leave them here for a moment, suspended in their attraction, their bodies leaning closer, their souls trembling in recognition. The goddess who wanted to be held, the shepherd who dared to desire her. Two beings, opposite in nature, yet bound in passion, their union already reshaping the rhythm of the world. This is their beginning, not of the myth itself, but of their love. A beginning as intoxicating as spring, as perilous as flood, as fleeting as the breath between one heartbeat and the next. And it is here, in their desire, that the seeds of conflict are sown. Desire is never still. It swells, it devours, it spreads its roots through every thought until nothing else can breathe. What began as the quiet awe of a goddess bending toward a mortal, and the trembling surrender of a shepherd daring to meet her gaze, soon deepened into a hunger that neither could control. Their love was no longer a secret touch in the twilight, no longer a fleeting glance exchanged among the fields. It became an all-consuming fire, threatening to outshine even the sun. Ishtar, radiant and restless, had never been content with half measures. Her passions, once stirred, demanded fullness. In Tammuz she found not only beauty, but a kind of sweetness her divine heart had long hungered for. Fragility, mortality, the glow of life that burned brighter for being brief. Each time she touched him, she felt the shadow of loss pressing closer. Each time she kissed him, she feared the moment when his lips would vanish into silence. And so her love, fierce and consuming, twisted into a desperate longing. She wanted to keep him, to bind him to her forever, to steal him from the arms of time itself. For Tammuz, the embrace of a goddess was both ecstasy and weight. To feel Ishtar's body against his was to feel the world tremble, to taste eternity's sweetness upon his tongue. Yet behind the ecstasy lurked the ache of his own fragility. He was mortal, and though her arms made him feel eternal, he knew his bones would still wither, his flesh would still decay. Each caress reminded him of the gulf between them. She would endure, he would fade. And in his quiet heart he wondered, could a goddess truly love something destined to vanish? The more Ishtar's desire grew, the more the natural order resisted. For love between gods and mortals was never simple, never safe. The world itself seemed to shift beneath their union. Crops bloomed too swiftly, rains lingered too long, flocks multiplied and then dwindled. The balance of seasons, fragile and sacred, trembled in the wake of their passion. The other gods, watchful and stern, whispered their disapproval. The cycles of life and death, of growth and decay, could not be broken without cost. Ishtar's longing to hold Tammuz forever was not only impossible, it was dangerous. But desire is death to reason. Desire is blind to consequence. In Ishtar's eyes, the gods' objections were chains to be broken, the seasons' rhythm an obstacle to be defied. She wanted Tammuz not only in the spring of his youth, but in every moment, beyond every limit. She wanted him to remain forever hers, untouched by time, untouched by death. And so she began to dream of ways to keep him, of weaving spells, of bending fate, of defying the very cycles that govern the world. Tammuz, though enchanted by her love, felt the weight of these dreams pressing upon him. He loved her, yes, with all the fervor of his mortal heart, but he also knew what she asked was impossible. Each night, lying in her arms, he felt torn between bliss and dread. Her kisses tasted of eternity, yet his breath came shorter, his heart beat faster, reminding him that he was but a man. He wondered if she loved him,
or if she loved only the illusion of him, the fleeting glow she wished to capture, the springtime she longed to make eternal. It was here that the true conflict arose, not from the disapproval of gods, not from the trembling of seasons, but from within their very embrace. Ishtar's passion was too fierce, too unyielding, too demanding for the fragile vessel of mortality. She wanted him whole, forever, untouched by decay. He wanted to give her everything, yet feared that in doing so he would lose himself. Their love, once a sanctuary, now carried within it a quiet terror, the knowledge that the more tightly they held one another, the more surely they would break. Their nights together became both bliss and torment. When she touched him, he felt as if his body dissolved into fire, as if the world vanished and only her remained. Yet even as she surrendered, some part of him whispered of endings, of the moment her arms would grasp only absence. And she, feeling that whisper in his trembling, clung all the harder, kissed all the deeper, as if her passion alone could silence the ticking of time. In the temples, the priests spoke of their union in hushed tones. They said the goddess of love herself had fallen too deeply, too recklessly, into the arms of a mortal. They said the balance of the world trembled beneath their desire. Some prayed in awe, longing for a love so fierce. Others prayed in fear, dreading the chaos such passion might unleash. For it was known that when gods defied the natural order, the earth itself bore the scars. But Ishtar cared nothing for whispers, nothing for balance, nothing for fate. Her eyes burned only for Tammuz. Her hands sought only his skin. Her lips hungered only for his breath. She had conquered kings and toppled armies, yet none of it satisfied her as much as the shepherd's touch. In him she found both agony and ecstasy, both sweetness and despair. He was not power, not glory, but something far more dangerous, the promise of loss. And so her love twisted into obsession. She whispered vows to him beneath the stars, promises that even death would not part them. She pressed her forehead to his and swore that she would never let him go. Her passion became both blessing and burden, her desire both cradle and chain. She wanted to keep him safe, but in her desperation she threatened to smother him beneath the weight of her longing.
Tammuz, though he adored her, felt the edges of that weight pressing closer with every embrace. He loved her not as goddess, but as woman, yet the divine fire in her eyes often reminded him of the gulf he could never cross. He wanted to give her joy, but feared the moment when her desire would demand more than his mortal frame could bear. For how long can fragility withstand eternity's grasp? Thus their union became a battlefield, passion against inevitability, hunger against fragility, divine will against mortal truth. Ishtar's kisses were declarations of war against death itself. Tammuz's caresses were confessions of surrender to a fate he could not escape. And between them, love burned brighter and brighter, even as its light cast longer shadows. The external world mirrored their struggle.
Fields grew wild, untamed, as if unsure whether to bloom or wither. Seasons stuttered in their rhythm, spring lingering too long, autumn arriving too soon. The people felt the tremor of imbalance, though they could not name its source. They only knew that something in the heavens was restless, that a love too fierce was shaking the very fabric of the world. And within the heart of this unrest, the goddess and the shepherd clung to one another, she eternal and aching, desperate to bind what must slip away, he fragile and trembling, desperate to give love even as he feared its cost. Their passion, overwhelming, became both their sanctuary and their undoing. This is the nature of desire. It does not ask, it demands. It does not wait, it consumes. And in Ishtar and Tammuz, we see desire at its most intoxicating, its most perilous. Love pressed so tightly against loss that the two become indistinguishable. A goddess longing to keep, a mortal aching to give, a world trembling as their passion dares to challenge the order of life and death. And so the conflict takes root not in anger, but in longing, not in betrayal, but in love too fierce to be borne. A goddess who cannot let go, a mortal who cannot stay, a passion so overwhelming that it strains the very limits of existence. This is their desire, beautiful, unbearable, eternal in its intensity, yet fragile in its truth. It is here, in this unbearable tension, that the seeds of tragedy are sown. For love that burns so brightly cannot last. It must either consume or collapse. And for Ishtar and Tammuz, both paths lead toward sorrow.
Desire had grown into obsession, and obsession had ripened into something even fiercer, defiance. No longer was their love a secret sigh in the twilight, a hesitant kiss stolen from the silence of fields. Now it was fire, burning, unyielding, reckless. For Ishtar and Tammuz had reached the point where passion no longer asked permission, where love itself became an act of rebellion. They clung to one another not only as lovers, but as warriors standing against fate, daring to believe that longing could bend eternity. Nights became their sanctuary. When the stars hung heavy above the plains and the sheep rested in quiet slumber, Ishtar descended, radiant and trembling with hunger. Her beauty glowed not with divine distance, but with intimate fire, as if the heavens themselves leaned close to watch. She wrapped herself around Tammuz with the desperation of one who feared the dawn might steal him away. Each touch was fevered, each kiss a vow, each embrace a refusal to surrender him to the passing of time. Theirs was not gentle love. It was consuming, insatiable. Her lips claimed his with a hunger that spoke of eternity, pressing against his mortality as though she could fuse his fleeting flesh into permanence. His hands traced the lines of her divine body, trembling yet insistent, as if mapping her skin could anchor her to him. They whispered to each other in tones thick with urgency, words that dissolved into sighs, sighs that dissolved into silence, silence that carried the weight of eternity itself. In those moments there was no goddess and no shepherd, only two bodies trembling against the inevitability of separation. Ishtar, normally so radiant with command, surrendered herself to his touch. She allowed herself to be vulnerable, to ache, to need. And Tammuz, fragile though he was, rose to meet her with the courage of desire, pouring into her all the devotion of his fleeting heart. Their union was not merely physical, it was spiritual, a fusion of fragility and eternity, a binding of opposites into one. But beneath the ecstasy pulsed dread. Every caress was tinged with the knowledge that it could not last. Every gasp of pleasure carried within it the echo of future grief. For though they loved as if time were theirs to command, the truth of mortality lingered like a shadow at the edge of the bed. Tammuz could feel it in the weight of his breath, in the tremor of his heart, in the frailty of his body pressed against hers. And Ishtar, though she kissed him as if to devour the years, knew that each moment of bliss only deepened the wound of his eventual loss.
And so love became defiance. They clung as if to prove the gods wrong, as if passion itself could rewrite the laws of life and death. Their nights together were battles against inevitability, every kiss a sword, every touch a shield. When Ishtar pressed her lips to Tammuz's skin, she was not merely loving him, she was declaring war on mortality. When Tammuz whispered her name into the hollow of her throat, he was not merely surrendering. He was pleading with the universe to grant him more time. The world around them reflected their fire. Blossoms bloomed out of season, rivers surged with sudden abundance, the air grew thick with scents too sweet, too heavy. The cycles trembled under their passion, as though nature itself bent beneath the force of their union. Yet even in this bending lay the whisper of imbalance, the forewarning of collapse. For the earth could not endure love that sought to consume eternity. Their bodies spoke where words failed. She arched into him with the grace of a goddess undone, her cries sharp enough to pierce the silence of the heavens. He held her as if she were not divine, but flesh and blood, his equal, his beloved. And in that holding she felt both ecstasy and fear. Ecstasy in being seen not as goddess, but as woman. Fear in the knowledge that only a mortal could make her feel so deeply, so dangerously. At the height of their union, the line between pleasure and grief blurred. Tears mingled with sweat, sighs with sobs, as if their bodies understood what their hearts refused to accept. Ishtar clutched him as though her grasp could anchor him to eternity, her nails marking his skin, her lips desperate to taste every inch before it was too late. Tammuz, overwhelmed, gave himself fully, surrendering not only his body, but his soul, knowing that to be loved by a goddess was both his blessing and his doom. In their whispers there were promises. She vowed she would never let him go, that no underworld, no god, no shadow could take him from her. He vowed he would love her until his last breath, even if that breath came too soon. Their vows were tender, yet beneath them throbbed desperation, for both knew they were making promises against the tide of eternity, promises that desire alone could not keep. And still they clung. For what is love if not a refusal to yield? What is passion if not defiance of all that would end it? They loved not as mortals love, cautiously within the safety of time, but as immortals might love, recklessly, as though time itself could be consumed by their fire. And yet one of them was mortal. One of them would fade. And so their passion, for all its brilliance, was already shadowed by loss.
The audience of their myth, the people who told it, who whispered it in temples and fields, felt both awe and dread. For who would not long for such passion? Who would not ache to be loved so fiercely by a goddess, or to hold a mortal so tenderly that eternity itself bent low? And yet, who would not fear the cost? Their story shimmered with beauty, but its beauty was edged with sorrow, like a blossom too heavy for its stem. The climax of their love was not only ecstasy, it was the ache of knowing ecstasy cannot last. It was the tremor of lips pressed together not only in desire, but in desperation. It was the way their bodies became altars of both joy and mourning, each embrace a hymn, each sigh a prayer, each climax a fleeting victory against the shadow of death. When dawn came, it was always cruel. The light broke their spell, reminding Tammuz of his mortality, reminding Ishtar of what she could not change. She would rise furious at the sun, furious at the world, furious at her own powerlessness. He would hold her one last time before she vanished into the heavens, his body still trembling with the memory of her touch. And though they would meet again with nightfall, each parting sharpened the wound, deepened the ache, fed the fire of their defiance. Thus their love reached its peak, a union of bodies and souls so consuming it threatened to unravel the very order of existence. They clung as if love itself could defeat fate, as if passion could silence the ticking of time. And for a moment, just a moment, they almost believed it could. But the audience, the tellers of the myth, the listeners who carried it through centuries, knew what the lovers could not admit, that love burning so brightly must collapse into shadow, that no defiance, however fierce, can silence the inevitability of loss, that ecstasy and dread are but two faces of the same truth. And so, at the very height of their passion, the shadow deepens. Their love is radiant, yes, but it trembles at its edges, fragile as glass, brilliant as fire, doomed as stars falling from the heavens. For though they cling with all their strength, separation looms closer, waiting like a silent guest at the edge of their bed. This is the climax of their myth. Not only the ecstasy of bodies entwined, but the trembling awareness that even gods cannot escape the gravity of fate.
The fire of their passion, for all its brilliance, could not burn forever without cost. The world, fragile in its balance, had begun to strain beneath their defiance. Fields yielded too much, too soon. Blossoms broke open out of season, unable to endure their own beauty. The earth trembled with excess, as if the order of life itself grew unsteady under the weight of Ishtar's love. For where there is abundance beyond measure, there must follow scarcity. Where passion seeks to consume eternity, eternity itself must answer. It was not long before the gods took notice. The rhythms of birth and death, of ripening and decay, had always been sacred. But now they faltered, tugged out of harmony by the goddess who clung too fiercely to a mortal's fleeting form. Whispers rose in the heavens, "This could not last, this should not last. A mortal cannot stand in the arms of eternity without consequence." And so fate moved, silent and inevitable. Tammuz, the tender shepherd whose beauty had ensnared the goddess of love herself, was called to descend, not by his will nor by hers, but by the deep and ancient laws that bound all existence. For his fragility was the key to balance. His death would restore what their love had unraveled. The day came quietly, yet it struck like thunder in Ishtar's heart. Tammuz's body, once so vibrant with warmth and desire, faltered beneath the weight of mortality. His breath grew shallow, his gaze distant, as if shadows tugged at his soul from beneath the earth. She clutched him to her breast, her tears falling like rivers, her voice rising in cries that shook the heavens. But no divine power, not even hers, could bar the gates of the underworld from claiming him. When his final breath escaped, it felt as though the world itself exhaled into silence. The fields withered, flowers bent their heads, the rivers slowed. The air grew heavy with grief, as if nature itself mourned alongside the goddess. For Ishtar's sorrow was no private ache, it was a wound carved into the heart of the earth. She would not accept it. She could not. To lose Tammuz was to lose not only a lover, but a piece of herself, a fragment of desire that had made her feel more alive than divinity ever had. In her anguish, she descended to the gates of the underworld, determined to reclaim him from the shadows.
But the underworld was a place where desire burned cold. Its gates were sealed with laws older than the gods, and its queen, fierce and unyielding, met Ishtar with silence. To enter, the goddess of love was forced to surrender her adornments, piece by piece, her jewels, her crown, her garments of radiance, until she stood naked and stripped of power before the throne of death. There she begged for her beloved, her voice trembling with rage and longing. The underworld listened, but it did not yield, for Tammuz was no longer merely a man. He had become a symbol, bound to the cycles of time itself. To release him fully would unravel the balance of fertility and decay,
abundance and barrenness. He could not remain with Ishtar forever. He must spend part of the year in shadow and part in light, his fate entwined with the turning of the seasons. Thus was struck the cruelest bargain. Tammuz would rise for half the year, his presence bringing life, blossoming fields, and the warmth of renewal. But for the other half, he would descend, and the earth would grieve with Ishtar, its fields barren, its rivers low, its air heavy with longing. Life itself became a reflection of her passion and her sorrow, a mirror of her eternal yearning. When he returned to her after his first descent, their reunion was fierce, desperate, filled with kisses that trembled on the edge of tears. She held him as though to devour every moment, knowing too well it would end again. Their love, once radiant with the illusion of eternity, was fractured now, fractured by the cruel rhythm of absence and return. Each embrace was shadowed by parting, each parting softened only by the promise of reunion. And so the myth became more than a story of love. It became the rhythm of the earth itself. When Tammuz was with her, the world bloomed, grasses swayed, rivers surged, blossoms filled the air with fragrance. When he was gone, the land mourned, curling inward, brittle and barren, as if the soil itself wept for their separation. The people of Mesopotamia lived by this cycle, planting and harvesting, mourning and celebrating, their lives bound to the eternal dance of Ishtar and Tammuz. For Ishtar, it was both a torment and a strange form of solace. Though she could not hold him forever, she had not lost him entirely. He was hers in fragments, in seasons, in glimpses of ecstasy that defied oblivion. Her grief became ritual, her passion became the pulse of fertility itself. Through her mourning, the earth learned to rest. Through her joy, it learned to blossom anew. Her love, though fractured, became eternal not in unity, but in yearning.
Yet yearning is a cruel eternity. When she lay beside him in the months of his return, her caresses trembled with desperation. Her body pressed to his as if to memorize him anew, to drink his presence as though it were water and she were parched. Her lips sought him with an urgency that came from knowing they would soon be denied. And he, tender Tammuz, gave himself with equal devotion, his every touch an offering, his every word a farewell, even as he whispered of forever. In this cycle, their passion was transformed. It was no longer the defiant blaze of lovers believing they could conquer time. It became instead the aching beauty of those who know they cannot, and yet love still. Their intimacy deepened, tinged always with grief, their union a mixture of bliss and mourning. Every kiss was an elegy, every embrace a hymn. And so the world learned through them that love does not conquer death, but dances with it. That passion cannot erase loss, but it can transform it into meaning. That even gods, radiant and powerful, are bound by the rhythm of mortality when they choose to love mortals. For Ishtar, the outcome was cruel, but it was also luminous. She had lost the illusion of eternity, yet gained something deeper. A love so powerful it shaped the turning of seasons, the lives of countless mortals, the very heartbeat of the world. And though she ached each time he slipped back into the shadows, she also knew that he would return, and that in their union, even fractured, even incomplete, they had become eternal after all. Thus the story of their passion reached its outcome. It was not victory, nor was it utter defeat. It was transformation. Desire turned into cycle, grief turned into ritual, love turned into the endless pulse of life and death. Their passion lingered, not as eternal union, but as eternal yearning. A yearning written into the soil, into the rivers, into the breath of the wind itself. And the world, touched by their story, learned to live by it, sowing and reaping, mourning and celebrating, always remembering that beauty is fragile, that passion is perilous, and that love, though it cannot defeat death, can echo through eternity in its longing.
Love, in the story of Ishtar and Tammuz, is a force that both creates and destroys, a fire that illuminates and burns, a sweetness that carries within it the bitter ache of inevitability. Their union, fierce and overwhelming, defied the natural order for brief, breathtaking moments. Yet that defiance, as intoxicating as it was, could not endure. Desire, as brilliant and consuming as it may be, always meets its mirror in mortality. Even gods, radiant and powerful, cannot forever preserve what is fragile. And so, in the end, their love became a rhythm rather than a resting place, a cycle rather than permanence, a song both beautiful and unbearably sad. Ishtar, the goddess of love and passion, had known the thrill of possession, the intoxicating power of desire fulfilled. But with Tammuz, that power transformed. In his mortal presence, she discovered a depth of longing that was new, terrifying, and exquisite. He was not a subject to her will. He was a living, breathing heart, fragile and fleeting, and in that fragility lay the paradox she could not conquer. The more fiercely she embraced him, the more aware she became of his mortality, and the more fiercely she grieved the knowledge that their time together would always be limited. Tammuz, for his part, experienced love in its purest intensity. To be adored by a goddess was a gift beyond imagination, yet it carried the weight of inevitability. His body, ephemeral and tender, could not endure her fire indefinitely. Each embrace, each kiss, each whisper of passion was heightened by the awareness that their closeness was temporary. His love was defined as much by longing as by fulfillment, as much by sorrow as by joy. In every caress, he felt both heaven and earth pressing upon him, the glory of divine love and the terror of mortality entwined. Their love, once secret and tender, became a force that shaped the world itself. When Tammuz ascended from the underworld each spring, the earth responded. Rivers swelled, fields ripened, blossoms unfurled in a riot of color and fragrance. The warmth of his presence revived the land, and with it Ishtar's joy reached its pinnacle. But even in these moments of reunion,
the shadow of absence loomed. For though they were together, they knew it was not forever. The pleasure of their embrace was sharpened by the knowledge that it would soon end, that separation was inevitable. When Tammuz descended once more, the world mourned with Ishtar. The rivers receded, leaving the soil dry and cracked. Fields bent beneath the weight of absence, and the air itself seemed to tremble with sorrow. The goddess's grief was no longer a private anguish. It was woven into the very fabric of life, marking the seasons, guiding the cycles of growth and decay, infusing every human heart with the bittersweet knowledge of love and loss. Fertility itself became a reflection of passion tempered by sorrow.
Through this endless rhythm, their love attained a kind of immortality, not as a permanent embrace, but as an eternal echo. Every bloom, every harvest, every sigh of the wind carries within it the memory of their passion, the mark of longing, the trace of ecstasy entwined with grief. This is the paradox that their myth preserves, that beauty, desire, and joy are amplified precisely because they are temporary, because they are fragile, because they are bound to vanish. The reflection deepens when one considers the human heart. Every soul that has loved knows the mixture of ecstasy and despair that defines Ishtar and Tammuz's story. To love deeply is to risk loss. To desire fully is to invite suffering. Yet it is precisely this vulnerability that gives passion its intensity, its sweetness, its enduring resonance. The mortal and the divine, in their story, remind us that even the fleeting can leave an indelible mark, that even the transient can shape eternity. Ishtar herself embodies this duality. Her radiance, once a symbol of power and command, became a mirror of tenderness and grief. In her sorrow, she discovered a new form of strength, the ability to channel her longing into creation, to transform loss into rhythm, to shape the very cycles of life and death through the intensity of her emotions. The goddess of love, who once sought possession, learned to find meaning in absence, to see eternity not only in what is held, but in what returns again and again. And Tammuz, whose mortal fragility made him the object of divine desire, found a different kind of immortality. Though he was bound to the underworld for part of the year, his return marked the revival of life, the renewal of hope, and the perpetuation of desire. In his brief moments on earth, he embodied the perfect tension between fragility and power, mortality and eternity. Each year, his brief presence reminded the world that passion, though impermanent, could become everlasting in its influence. Their love, therefore, is both a model and a caution. It teaches that desire cannot conquer death, that passion cannot suspend the cycles of existence. Yet it also shows that love, even when fractured, can become immortal in memory, in ritual, in the patterns of the natural world. Every embrace, every tear, every sigh becomes part of the eternal rhythm, echoing through the rivers, the fields, and the hearts of those who remember. The sensuality of their union cannot be separated from its sorrow. The intensity of desire, the heat of touch, the trembling whispers in the night, these were all heightened by the awareness of impending loss. Pleasure and grief became inseparable, each amplifying the other. To feel one was to feel both. To remember one was to remember both. And in this entwining lies the true beauty of their story, that passion gains meaning only when tempered by impermanence, that love shines most brightly when shadowed by absence. Listen closely, and the earth itself tells the tale. The first blossoms of spring, delicate and fleeting, carry the echo of Tammuz' return. The dying leaves of autumn, curling and brown, reflect Ishtar's mourning. Every river's swell, every harvest, every silent night carries fragments of their union. The cycles of life and death, growth and decay, desire and grief, all trace back to the intensity of a goddess who loved too fiercely and a mortal who could not endure forever. In this reflection, we find a lesson that resonates with every listener. To love is to embrace risk, to desire is to acknowledge loss. Yet in embracing the impermanent, we touch the eternal. The myth of Ishtar and Tammuz leaves us not with despair, but with a profound awareness that life, love, and beauty are precious precisely because they fade, because they cannot last, because their fleeting nature sharpens their sweetness. Their story also reminds us that love's power is not measured by duration, but by intensity. A single moment of true passion can reshape worlds, alter seasons, and echo through eternity. In their longing, we witness the transformative potential of desire, how grief can fuel growth, how absence can heighten presence, how fleeting intimacy can leave indelible traces.
Even now, as centuries pass, the myth endures. When the earth awakens each spring, Tammuz rises again, bringing life, hope, and love reborn. When the land falls into autumn slumber, Ishtar mourns once more, and the world pauses in gentle grief. Their cycle is unending, their passion immortal, and yet always tinged with impermanence. Every human heart, touched by love, carries within it the same rhythm: desire, fulfillment, separation, return. And so, as we listen to their story, we are invited into a contemplation of our own lives. We recognize the fleeting nature of pleasure, the inevitability of loss, and the enduring power of memory and longing. We see that passion, when lived fully, leaves a mark not only upon the self, but upon the world. And we feel the resonance of Ishtar's longing and Tammuz's fragility within our own hearts, reminding us that beauty, joy, and desire are never truly lost. They are transformed into rhythm, into ritual, into eternal reflection. Every spring bloom is Tammuz reborn. Every withering fall is Ishtar's grief. Their love, fractured and incomplete, is yet eternal in its echo.
It is a story that teaches, warns, and seduces, leaving a lingering fascination in all who hear it. It lingers in the air like perfume, in the soil like seed, in the soul like memory. The myth closes not with finality, but with resonance, a gentle, aching pulse that reminds us that even when passion cannot conquer time, it can transform it, shaping beauty and longing into patterns that endure forever. And so we leave the myth, standing in the shadow of desire and grief, in awe of beauty that cannot last, in reverence for love that cannot hold. We carry within us the echo of their embrace, the tremor of their whispered promises, the sweetness of their fleeting union. And in that echo, we are reminded that life itself is but a reflection of love, brilliant, fragile, fleeting, yet infinitely precious.